Imagine that, spending 40 years walking through a hot, barren desert. How odd that this was the fate of the people of God, that it took them so long to make their way to the Promised Land. What can we learn from Israel's long trek through the wilderness? Let's follow them through the books of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and find out what this journey can teach us about our own journey through this life towards our ultimate destiny. Shalom and welcome to God's Story, Our Story, Catholics for Israel's online Bible course. I'm Dr. Andre Villeneuve. So God delivered Israel out of slavery. He made a covenant with them at Mount Sinai and gave them the Torah as their national constitution to teach them how to live as God's people. True, they sinned badly when they worshipped the golden calf, but God forgave them and He set up the tabernacle where they could worship Him and remain in friendship with Him. So they were good to go, right? Promised land, here we come. Well, not exactly. As it turns out, it took just one day to take Israel out of Egypt, but 40 years to take Egypt out of Israel. Those long years of wandering in the wilderness taught Israel that they still had quite a way to go, not just to get to the land of Canaan, but also to learn what it means to live as God's people. These books are truly marvelous. Leviticus teaches Israel the importance of sacrifice and how they should be holy as God is holy. Numbers tells us about Israel's journey through the wilderness, from the heights of obedience, faith, and courage to the lows of rebellion, disbelief, and cowardice. Finally, Deuteronomy, the last testament of Moses, prepares Israel to enter the Promised Land, setting before them the two ways that we have seen before, way back in the Garden of Eden, the way of life and the way of death. Before we begin, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, click the notification bell, and post your questions and comments below. Israel in the wilderness, God leads His people towards the Promised Land. We're going to split up this unit into 3 videos, and the focus of today's video is on the book of Leviticus, Israel's call to holiness. Now, for some reason, the book of Leviticus is not on the bedside reading table of most people. I'm not sure why, because it's such an interesting and fascinating book. So we're going to try to uncover some of the mysteries of the book of Leviticus in our study today. A book that seems so mysterious, and let's be honest, it seems irrelevant to most modern people today. In many ways, we might say that the book of Leviticus is at the heart of the Torah. If we backtrack a little bit, recall that the Torah begins with the book of Genesis. It's the first book of the Bible, and Genesis, of course, is about the creation of the world, the creation of Adam and Eve, their dwelling place in the Garden of Eden, a place of peace, of communion, of friendship with God, and generally of prosperity and of happiness. And we know that all this came to a brutal end when Adam and Eve sinned, and this led to their expulsion from the Garden of Eden and their long exile. The rest of the book of Genesis focuses on the lives of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and his sons, whom God the Father raises up to become His family, the people of Israel. By the time we come to the book of Exodus, the second book, we go from Genesis, the book of origins, to Exodus, the book of redemption or salvation. The children of Israel at this point have become a great nation, but they have become enslaved in Egypt. And so God shows up and redeems them. He delivers them from Egyptian slavery, takes them through the waters of the Red Sea, and brings them to Mount Sinai, where He makes a covenant with them, a family bond, adopting them as a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. They will become His treasured possession and chosen people. The covenant on Mount Sinai, as we saw, is also a type of betrothal by which God betroths Israel that will become His bride. So God makes this covenant with Israel. We saw how they sinned grievously by worshiping the golden calf, but God renewed the covenant and also established the tabernacle as a place of worship where Israel would enter into communion with God. And we said that the tabernacle was a type of also of return to Eden, pointing back to this place of communion, of fellowship with God that they originally had in the Garden of Eden. So God established this covenant with Israel at Mount Sinai, but how should Israel live as God's people? And this is truly the focus of the book of Leviticus, the book of holiness. It's a book that consists of mostly laws, but these laws are very important because they reveal what it means to be God's people and how Israel should be holy just as God is holy. So that's what we're going to focus on today. Then next time we'll look at the book of Numbers, the book of wanderings, and the book of Numbers has a lot of parallels with the book of Exodus. As you can see, in Exodus, Israel went from Egypt to Mount Sinai, and in the book of Numbers, we're going to see the people of Israel wandering from Mount Sinai towards the Promised Land. So that's what we call a chiastic structure, this A, B, C, B, A structure. And so you can guess by now that the book of Deuteronomy is going to have a lot of parallels with the book of Genesis, just as Genesis portrayed this place of dwelling between God and man in the Garden of Eden. The book of Deuteronomy will portray the land of Israel as a type of return to the Garden of Eden, this book of Deuteronomy being mostly Moses' final speeches, his final testament before dying, and sending off the children of Israel to enter the Promised Land. We're going to see how the Promised Land is depicted in a lot of imagery that recalls the Garden of Eden, such as being fruitful and multiplying and living in peace and prosperity in abundance and so on. But for today, we begin with this book of Leviticus, which, as we said, is the heart of the Torah and the key for Israel to live in a holy way just as God is holy. How much time do we cover in the book of Leviticus? About 1 month. We're told at the end of the book of Exodus, chapter 40, verse 17, that it was the first day of the first month of the second year. And then at the beginning of the book of Numbers, we're told that it was the first day of the second month of the second year. So it gives us just 1 month between Exodus and Numbers to fit in the book of Leviticus. And to be fair, there's almost no narrative in Leviticus. It's all legal materials. And so that's why it doesn't seem like we're covering a lot of time. What's the general structure of the book of Leviticus? We said that Leviticus is the book of holiness. And where does holiness begin? Obviously with God, who is the ultimate source of all holiness. And where does God dwell in Israel? He dwells in the tabernacle. So the first half of Leviticus, chapters 1 to 16, focus on the holiness of the tabernacle and the ritual purity that is essential for Israel to enter into God's presence. Then, the second half of Leviticus, chapters 17 to 27, focus on the emanation of holiness from the tabernacle outwardly to the whole camp, to the whole people of Israel. In other words, we begin with the holiness of God in the tabernacle, and we continue and conclude the book with the holiness of the entire people that has originated from the tabernacle. If we look at a bit of a more detailed outline of the book of Leviticus, we're going to see that we begin with sacrifices and offerings. The first 7 chapters pointing to all the various sacrifices that Israel is obligated to offer to the Lord, beginning with regulations for lay people, then regulations for priests. Then in chapters 8 to 10, we look at the institution of the priesthood, the consecration of Aaron and his sons, then their installation, the beginning of their priestly ministry. And then tragically, we see disaster strikes with the death of 2 of Aaron's sons, Nadab and Avihu, on that first day of the inauguration of the priestly ministry. Then in chapters 11 to 15, we're going to look at the cleanliness code, otherwise known as the laws of ritual purity. And as we said, these are the conditions that are necessary for Israel to enter into God's presence. And at the heart of the book, the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur, the one day of the year when the high priest could come into the tabernacle, bring in some blood of the animals that had been offered for the sake of atoning for his own sins and the sins of the whole people. So, as we're going to see, the book of Leviticus is all about restoring this communion between God and his people, and at the heart of the restoration of this communion is blood atonement. Then in chapters 17 through 26, we're in the holiness code. And as we said, this stipulates the various laws by which Israel should be holy and live in a holy and righteous way before the Lord. This is going to include the sanctity of blood, moral laws, including especially sexual morality, laws of priestly holiness, feasts and appointed times, continual offerings, then a short narrative about a blasphemer, the lex talionis, or law of retribution, then the sabbatical year, the jubilee year, and it's going to conclude with the blessings and curses, followed by a short epilogue on vows and tithes. Speaking of chiasm, as you can see, the whole book of Leviticus is also ordered in a form of chiasm. And so we're going to begin with liturgy and we're going to end with liturgy. Then the text moves on to the priesthood, and the penultimate section of the book is also on priesthood. Then we see a shift towards purity, and so ritual purity here in chapters 11 to 15, and then chapters 18 to 20, moral purity, and at the heart of the book, the question of blood atonement for the sake of forgiving the people's sins. So let's start with this, the symbolism of sacrifice. Exodus chapter 32, right after the sin of the golden calf, already made this important statement. Whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book. And so let's remember that the consequence of sin is separation from God, suffering, and death. And so if Israel is to live in communion with God, they need to have a solution to the universal problem of sin. That's why at the center of Israel's worship was sacrificial blood atonement for forgiveness and communion. So sacrifices are symbols of repentance, whereby the gap between God and man that's caused by sin is bridged by the atoning death of an animal and shedding of its blood. As you recall, sin is incompatible with God's presence, and its consequence is death. By offering sacrifices, man overcomes the alienation and death sentence which sin has brought upon him. And this is done not just by transferring his sins upon the animal, but also on transferring his whole identity through this act of smicha, of laying on one's hands upon the animal and leaning on it and transferring one's whole persona onto the animal. So what does sacrifice mean? When we think of sacrifice in English, we mostly think of giving something up, and that meaning is still there in the Hebrew concept, but primarily the Hebrew meaning of sacrifice, the word is korban in Hebrew. What does korban mean? It's based on the root karav in Hebrew, which means to bring close, to draw near. So what's the point of the sacrifices? It's to draw men near to God and once again overcome this gap, this chasm that has been caused by sin. Sacrifices are obviously also a gift from man to God, and it involves the abnegation and renunciation by man and its acceptance by God. Sacrifices are kadosh, they're holy, that is, they're set apart for God himself. And at the heart of this concept of sacrifice is the concept of substitution. Now, substitution involves repentance, redemption, and forgiveness. As we said, it's for the sake of restoring the communion between God and man. And there's also this idea of atonement. Here with atonement, we do see a pun in English that we don't have in Hebrew, and that's at one-ment. In other words, what is atonement? It's for the sake of restoring the oneness between man and God, of bridging this gap between God and man that was caused by sin. So as I mentioned, it involves transferring one's sins onto the animal that is to be sacrificed through this act of smicha, of laying on the hands upon the animal and transferring one's sins, but also one's whole person onto the animal, so that the animal becomes representative of its owner. And what's the sacrifice? It's a type of execution in effigy with a rehabilitative purpose. And so as the person who sinned stands before God in the tabernacle or in the temple, he witnesses his own execution by proxy for sins that he committed. And so the owner of the offering is called to reach this new level of awareness of what sin actually does and his obligations to God, and hopefully a firm resolve not to repeat this sin again. So that is the idea of vicarious punishment, as if it were carried out on the owner's own body. So the death of the animal should really be the death of the owner, which has been transferred onto the animal. What are the conditions for sacrifices? Sacrifices must be appointed by God. You can't just make up sacrifices as you want. It has to be regulated and set up by God. The sacrifice must belong to the owner, so you can't borrow or steal some animal that doesn't belong to you. The sacrifice must be free of blemishes. It must be also offered without leaven or honey, and with salt as a type of preservative to keep the sacrifice well. What kind of animals can you offer? Well, there aren't all that many. You can offer four-footed beasts, such as oxen, sheep, goats, or rams. And for the poor, they can also offer turtle doves or young pigeons. And that's all. No other animals can be offered as sacrifices in the tabernacle. What are some of the categories of sacrifices? And this is where we begin to see how complex this whole system was. Well, first there are public and private sacrifices. There were 10 public sacrifices that were all mandatory, and those were the sacrifices offered by the priests on the Sabbath. Every morning and every evening they had to offer a lamb, as we saw in the book of Exodus. At every major feast, the Passover, the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Tabernacles, there were specific sacrifices that they had to offer. But then there were also private sacrifices, which any individual could come and bring to the Lord on virtually any day of the year. And these included voluntary sacrifices and mandatory sacrifices. So as you can see, this is pretty complex. Voluntary sacrifices would be sacrifices in communion. If someone was already in communion with God, he could offer these free will voluntary offerings. If he was out of communion with God, then he had to offer mandatory sacrifices. Then we had another distinction between bloody and unbloody sacrifices. As we're going to see, most sacrifices were bloody, but there was also one category of sacrifices, the grain offerings or the mincha, that were unbloody. And also we have the distinction between most holy sacrifices and less holy sacrifices. The most holy sacrifices were all burnt sin and guilt offerings, all public peace offerings, and some grain offerings, whereas of lesser holiness were the personal peace offerings. What were the acts of sacrifice? What happened when an animal was sacrificed? Well, there was a division of tasks between the person offering the sacrifice and the priest. The offerer had to lay his hands upon the animal, and that's the act of smicha that I mentioned. He had to slay the animal, skin it, cut it up, and wash the inwards. So a pretty gross task, if you ask me. And then the priest also had 5 acts. He had to catch the blood, sprinkle it upon the altar, light up the altar fire, lay on the wood, and bring the pieces up to the altar. Let's zoom in a little more on the specific sacrifices that are enumerated in the book of Leviticus. And there are 5 major types of sacrifices. Let's begin with the sacrifices in communion. As we said, these are voluntary because they're for those who are already in communion with the Lord. The first one would be the whole burnt offering. In Hebrew, it's the olah, and this represented a complete dedication to God. As the name indicates, the entire sacrifice was burnt on the altar and went up in flames to the Lord. Nobody ate of the meat of that sacrifice. Then you have the grain offering. This is our one unbloody sacrifice. In Hebrew, it's mincha, and this would have been a flour offering, either flour mixed with oil and incense or various cakes or loaves that could have been offered to the Lord, either on their own or together with other sacrifices. Then we have the very interesting peace offering, or zevach shlamim. The root for shlamim is the same as shalom, and so a sacrifice of peace. This would have been a covenantal feast centered around the consumption of meat. And so the offerer could actually eat the meat of that sacrifice. And there were 3 types: a thanksgiving offering, or in Hebrew, the todah, the vow offering, and the free will offering. So 3 types of peace offerings could be offered to the Lord. Interestingly, the Midrash, the ancient Hebrew commentary on the book of Leviticus, this is Leviticus Rabbah, says this: in the age to come, all sacrifices will be annulled, but that of thanksgiving will not be annulled. And all prayers will be annulled, but that of thanksgiving will not be annulled. In other words, all these sacrifices one day will come to an end, except for the todah, except for the sacrifice of thanksgiving. And it's interesting that in Greek, the Hebrew word todah is Eucharistia. In other words, thanksgiving means Eucharist. And so it's a really interesting point of contact with the Catholic faith today that the only sacrifice that remains is the todah, or the Eucharistia, the Eucharist. Now the sacrifices for communion, as I said, these are mandatory because these are to be offered by someone who is out of communion with God because of some sin or some infraction that he or she has done. There's only two. The first one is the sin or purification offering. In Hebrew, this is the chatat. And this is for the sake of purifying or cleansing of spiritual defilement that has been caused by sin. Now, you didn't necessarily have to sin to offer a sin offering. That's why some think the term purification offering is better. So there were some situations of ritual uncleanness that required offering a purification offering. But generally, whenever there was an unintentional sin, a person had to offer a sin offering. Pretty closely related is the guilt offering. In Hebrew, that would be the asham, and a man or a woman had to offer this as indemnity or reparation payment for the sake of repairing damage or making restitution. So any kind of sin or infraction that was unintentional and required restitution, normally this would have required a guilt offering. Whereas when no restitution could be made, this would require a sin offering. This has been our introduction. Now let's move through the text of Leviticus. We're in chapter 1, and the first section is about private sacrifices and instructions for laypersons, and it begins with voluntary offerings. We're going to see a refrain through these chapters that keeps saying that these sacrifices are an offering by fire, a pleasing odor to the Lord. So these sacrifices somehow are pleasing to the Lord because they are offered by those who are already in communion with him. Leviticus begins with burnt offerings, going through cattle, sheep or goats, and birds. And so the procedure is necessary to offer those olot that completely went up to the Lord in smoke. Then chapter 2 is about the grain offerings. As we said, there are many ways of offering these unbloody offerings, either flour together with oil and frankincense, or baked in oven, baked on a griddle, cooked in a pan. You have various laws for grain offerings, and also the first fruits of the harvest are included here. Then in chapter 3, the text turns to peace offerings, and again, it goes through the various scenarios, offering cattle, offering sheep, and offering goats, and we're given instructions for laypersons from chapters 1 to 3. Chapter 4 turns to mandatory offerings, and so in chapter 4, verse 1, we turn to sin offerings, and these are organized according to the violator. So the higher the role of a person in the congregation of Israel, the greater sacrifice he had to offer. And so if a high priest sinned and had to offer a sin offering, he had to offer a very expensive bull. If the whole congregation somehow sinned, they also had to offer a bull. A ruler had to offer a male goat, and a lay person had to offer either a female goat or a lamb. Notice that in this section on mandatory offerings, we no longer hear that these were sacrifices that were pleasing to the Lord. We keep hearing that the priest shall make atonement for him and he shall be forgiven. So the major role of the sin and guilt offerings are for the sake of granting forgiveness to the one who has sinned. Then we have a section on specific transgressions, organized again according to status. And so the rich were to offer a female goat or lamb, the poor could offer 2 birds, and the very poor could offer as little as fine flour in order to atone for their sins through a sin offering. Chapter 5, verse 14 turns to guilt offerings, and it was almost always a ram that was offered for a guilt offering. This would have been offered in situations of misusing sanctuary property, if one was unsure if one sinned, or in cases of stealing from a neighbor. So that's the section on instructions for laypersons. Once we get to chapter 6, verse 8, the text turns to instructions for priests, and the order here is in decreasing order of holiness. And so it goes back to the burnt offerings, beginning with the most holy sacrifice, and it points to the tasks of the priest when they are receiving these offerings. They have to remove ashes, take care of the altar fire, and so on. Then it turns to grain offerings, the law of grain offering, the priest portion that they could eat, and the grain offering for priestly consecration. And then sin offerings, then guilt offerings, then peace offerings, including the todah, the thanksgiving offering, and then the vow and free will offerings. So recall there were 3 types of peace offerings. Okay, and this section concludes with a summary of the sacrifices to be offered. It's interesting that this whole section does not really give a whole lot of rationale why these sacrifices need to be offered. And so this we know through later tradition, through the Jewish oral law, and so on. We come to chapter 8, and it's the time for the priests to be consecrated. This actually repeats a section that we've seen before in Exodus chapter 29 and in Exodus 40. So actually it's repeated twice already. And what does the text tell us here? Well, first Aaron and his sons had to be washed and vested or clothed, and then Moses anointed them. So in these chapters, you can see that Moses is the proto-priest. He is the first high priest who actually anoints and prepares Aaron for his own priestly ministry. Sacrifices of consecration must be offered, beginning with a bull for a sin offering. So note that the sequence is always the same. Whenever there's a sequence of sacrifices, they always have to begin with a sin offering. And here it's a bull because it's the highest and most expensive offering that must be given for the high priest for his own purification and sanctification. Then a ram must be offered for burnt offering. So we begin with atonement, sin offering, and then burnt offering, which points to total consecration, total gift of self to God. And then a ram of consecration, which would have been a peace offering. So this included a blood ritual, a wave offering, so waving this offering to the Lord, and sprinkling oil and blood upon the altar. This was followed by a sacred meal, by which the newly ordained priests would have eaten, so to speak, with God. They would have had this festive banquet together with God to commemorate the institution of their priesthood. And this would have been repeated for 7 days, so it was not a one-day ceremony, but a one-week ceremony of their transition from the status of lay people to priests. On the 8th day, it's the installation of the priesthood. So for these first 7 days, it was Moses who did most of the work, but on the 8th day, it's the beginning of their actual ministry. We're given instructions for sacrifices, and then they must sacrifice, again, offerings for themselves. So Aaron and his sons, interestingly, their first sacrifice they must offer is a calf for a sin offering. So it sounds like there's a hint of an echo here of the golden calf that so wounded the priesthood in Exodus 32. And now the first offering they need to give is a sacrifice of a calf. Then a ram for burnt offering, and then they must offer sacrifices for the people. So a male goat for a sin offering, a calf and a lamb for burnt offerings, and then an ox and ram for peace offerings. You see, once again, the sequence is the same. You begin with a sin offering to take care of sin, to receive atonement, and then burnt offerings for total consecration, gift of self to the Lord, and then you end with peace offerings, this moment of communion and those sacrifices that the people could actually eat of. Following this, we have a priestly blessing, and the glory of the Lord appears and fills the sanctuary so that fire consumes the burnt offerings. And so this is the institution of the priesthood and the sacrificial system in Israel. As we said, we've actually already seen this in the book of Exodus twice already. Unfortunately, this celebratory day is marred and stained by a tragic event, the death of Nadav and Avihu, two of Aaron's sons. They offer strange fire before the Lord. The text is very brief and does not really give any kind of details. What does that mean exactly? What was this strange fire? All that we know is that they did something that the Lord had not commanded. They violate the laws of liturgy that the Lord had instituted. So that fire went out from the Lord and devoured them, and they died before the Lord. So as obscure and mysterious as this death seems, what the text does say is that the sacrificial liturgy that the Lord has instituted is not something to mess with. It's something that's extremely holy, extremely sanctified, and it must be obeyed in all its details. The bodies are taken out of the camp. There is no mourning that's allowed for Aaron upon the death of his sons. And we're told right after that, priests are not allowed to drink any alcohol before they minister in the sanctuary. Some exegetes say, well, maybe Nadav and Avihu were drunk when they came into the sanctuary, but we're not really given any details about this. And the priests are to distinguish between holy and common, unclean and clean. And this sets us up for the next section that will begin in chapter 11. So as you can see here in Leviticus 10, verses 10-11, you are to distinguish between the holy and the common, and between the unclean and the clean, and you are to teach the people of Israel all the statutes which the Lord has spoken to them by Moses. This is followed by some instructions on eating the day's offerings, and so we come to chapter 11 with the cleanliness code, or laws of ritual purity. And these chapters are going to cover clean and unclean animals, childbirth, leprosy and skin diseases, and bodily discharges. So what do we mean by this ritual purity? And this can be quite confusing. So how to distinguish between the holy, kodesh in Hebrew, and the common, chol in Hebrew, and between the unclean, tameh, and the clean, tahor. What's the difference between all these terms? Well, in a nutshell, we might say that holiness is the combination of ritual plus moral purity. What does it mean to be holy for ancient Israel? It means to be ritually pure and morally pure. So holiness, as we recall, means to be set apart, kodesh, and this is in opposition to common or chol. So holiness is not always contrasted to being in a state of sin. It just means to be set apart for a special purpose in contrast to just existing for a common purpose. And so holiness is a type of measure of the presence of God. And this does include for ancient Israel ritual purity, being clean as opposed to unclean, being tahor versus being tameh. Now, ritual purity is non-moral, quite in contrast to moral purity. And so ritual purity points to the suitability to be in the presence of God, and it is a prerequisite for holiness. Ritual purity applies not just to people, but also to animals, to things, and places. And sources of impurity are natural and unavoidable, so that being ritually impure is not a sin. As we're going to see, touching a dead body makes one impure, or even having nocturnal emissions or having sexual relations between husband and wife make them unclean. And so this is obviously not sinful, but it puts one in a certain state in which we cannot approach the sanctuary. So ritual impurity prevents one from entering the sanctuary and the holy realms. It conveys an impermanent contagion, and purity is achieved by washing and waiting. So usually there's a transition time that it's necessary to wait out until one is made pure again. By contrast, moral purity points to righteousness, that is following the Torah, versus sin or missing the mark, chet. And so moral purity is very much, as the name indicates, moral. So it's necessary for holiness, just as much as ritual purity, and it only applies to people, and this can involve thoughts, attitudes, words, and deeds by omission or commission. And so this is something that's much more internal. Ritual purity is always external and physical. Moral impurity results from committing abominations, in Hebrew to'eva, that is, things like sexual sins, idolatry, or bloodshed. And sins cause impurity that morally, but not ritually, defile the sinner, the land, and the sanctuary. So moral sins defile not just the person, but even the whole land and the sanctuary. And so in many ways, these moral sins and offenses against moral purity are more serious than ritual impurity. And there's no contagion by contact. As opposed to ritual purity, when this impurity can be transmitted by contact, this could not occur for moral purity. There's also no rite of purification. Purity is achieved either by punishment or atonement. So very different, the two concepts of ritual purity and moral purity, and both are essential for holiness. So here's a quick summary. Ritual purity, the source would be bodily flows, corpses, and so on. The effect is temporary, contagious impurity, and the resolution is by bathing and waiting. Whereas moral impurity, the source would be idolatry, incest, murder, and other sins. The effect, defilement of sinners, land and sanctuary, and the resolution would be atonement, punishment, and even exile. Okay, we're in chapter 11 of Leviticus. The laws of ritual purity involves what one eats. And so you are what you eat. And for ancient Israel, and even until today for observant Jews, it's very important to not eat anything. What we eat is very much regulated. So without really giving any explanation, Leviticus provides a list of animals that may be eaten. So among the land animals, those that have split hooves and chew the cud are permitted. All the others are forbidden. Among the fish, they must have fins and scales, and they are permitted. All others are forbidden. All birds of prey are off limits, and we're given some birds that are permitted. And most winged insects are also forbidden, except for things like locusts, crickets, and grasshoppers. Then we are told how certain animals convey contamination by touch, again, ritual impurity, by touching the carcass of unclean animals. Certain objects will transmit uncleanness, and also even the carcass of permitted animals will convey uncleanness. Paragraph on swarming things, and a conclusion that tells us, "For I am the Lord your God, consecrate yourselves therefore, and be holy, for I am holy." So this chapter 11 of Leviticus really lays down these basic rules of how Israel is to distinguish itself from the nations by their restricted diets. Expanding a little bit on that, we know that the kosher laws are central to Judaism from the time of the Bible until today. And what do they consist of? Well, the foundation for the kosher laws are these prohibited animals that we see in Leviticus 11, but it's much more than that. Those animals that are permitted must be ritually slaughtered in a proper way, and all blood must be drained from even the permitted animals. Certain parts of the permitted animals may not be eaten, such as certain types of fat. Most restrictive is there is to be no mixing of meat and dairy. That's why every food that is kosher is going to be either meat, dairy, or parve, which means neither meat nor dairy. And that in practical life is what's the most restrictive about eating kosher. Also, grape products made by non-Jews, especially wine, are prohibited. Fruits and vegetables must be inspected for bugs, and utensils and plates must be kosher. They must be designated to eat either meat or dairy, but not both. And also things that must be kosher for Passover must have no trace of leaven. So it's quite a complex system to eat kosher today. Now, why these laws? Why these dietary laws? There's actually no agreement among the rabbis on what's the purpose of these dietary laws. Some say that it's for health or hygienic reasons, that these forbidden animals are bad for one's health. Some say it's aesthetic, that the non-kosher animals are repugnant. Some would say that it's ethical and moral, that you somehow receive the nature of the animal when you eat that animal. So if you're eating a predator, for example, there is something violent about these animals that is transferred upon your own person. Anatomical, some say that the forbidden animals are in categories that should not be eaten. Theological or liturgical, the idea here is that these animals were consumed by pagans or used in pagan rites, and therefore you have to stay clear from them. National, some say that these animals were forbidden for the sake of creating a boundary between Israel and the nation so that they would not eat together. Disciplinary, some say that these laws, we don't know exactly why they exist, but the idea is to master over our will and not be animalistic and just eating everything, but it's a form of self-penance or self-denial by not eating certain forms of food. Mystical, some say that eating these non-kosher foods harms our spiritual potential and inhibit our ability to come into communion with God. And some say it's just obedience. It's for us to see whether we're going to obey God when he gives Israel these commandments. So all this to say that there's no complete consensus, but these are the reasons that have been proposed to keep kosher and why Leviticus ordains this for Israel. Chapters 12 to 14 are still about the laws of ritual purity having to do with humans. And so giving birth for a woman puts her in a situation of ritual impurity. A male child, she is impure for 7 days and then has a transition period of 33 days by which she cannot approach the sanctuary. It's a type of maternity leave, if you will. A female child, she remains impure for double the time, 14 days, and then 66 days of transitional period. The sacrifice that she is to offer. And then we have 2 long chapters on regulations concerning leprosy and skin diseases, which also reflect impurity. And so we are given prescriptions for the priest examining the people, examining garments, the purification that's required to bring them back into the state of purity, of communion with the rest of the camp, purification of homes, and a conclusion. So as we can see, these chapters really focus on ritual purity, which is physical and not necessarily sinful. Bodily discharges. Any kind of fluid that comes out of the body, these discharges cause uncleanness, including abnormal emissions of men, normal emissions of men, and at the heart of this chiasm, we see sexual intercourse, and then emissions of women. So what's the deal with that? All this to say that these situations of ritual impurity, what's the common thread here, is that they all have to do with either the beginning or the end of life. either having to do with sexuality or giving birth or approaching a dead body. And so this points to the fact that the realm of life and death is extremely sanctified. The boundaries of life and death point to a state that is highly regulated and apparently very important to God. The rationale is all these point to ritual and not moral impurity. So becoming unclean points to approaching the boundaries of life and death. Thus he shall keep the people of Israel separate from their uncleanness, lest they die in their uncleanness by defiling my tabernacle that is in their midst. We come to chapter 16. We've concluded our cleanliness code, and now we come to the heart of the book, Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement. And so what goes on here? Aaron must prepare himself, put on special garments that were olive white, so not his beautiful blue garments that we saw in the book of Exodus. And he's going to have to offer sacrifices. For the priest, a bull for a sin offering and a ram for burnt offering. And for the people, 2 goats, a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. Verses 6 to 10 were given a description of these offerings. So Aaron offers up this bull. He's going to cast lots on the 2 goats and decide that one will be offered to the Lord and the other one will be taken into the wilderness carrying the sins of the people. Aaron, or the high priest, kills the bull, and then he goes into the sanctuary and walks into the Holy of Holies this one time in the year on the Day of Atonement. He brings incense, lays it before the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies, and then goes out and then comes back in again with the blood of the bull for his own sins, which he's going to sprinkle in front of the mercy seat. Then he goes back out, kills the goat, and comes back with the blood of the goat to atone for the sins of the people. So a very elaborate, very critical ritual. There was no great margin of error, and the high priest had to do exactly what was prescribed in Leviticus, otherwise he would be struck dead. Once again, the idea was to provide atonement and forgiveness for the whole people of Israel through this blood ritual. So atonement was made for transgressions, and then atonement for the altar with the blood of the bull and the goat. In the meantime, the priest also had to confess the sins of the people upon the scapegoat, or the Azazel in Hebrew. And then the scapegoat would be led out into the wilderness. The people would curse it and would jeer at it because this goat was carrying all the sins of this people. So the whole idea was, good riddance. Let's get rid of this goat that's carrying all of our burdens, all our sins, and all of our iniquities. And this is not mentioned in Leviticus, but this goat was not just released in the wilderness, but he was thrown off a cliff, according to Jewish tradition, to his death. And this would have symbolized basically the annihilation of the sins of Israel and the restoration of their communion with God. Aaron then had to wash his clothes, and rams were offered for burnt offerings. And it was the 10th day of the 7th month, a day of penance and atonement that would have ended with great joy, knowing that the sins of Israel were forgiven. When we come to chapter 17, as we said, this is the beginning of the holiness code. So it begins with explaining the importance of blood and then turns to the requirements for Israel to live as a holy people. Here's an important verse in Leviticus 17. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that makes atonement for the soul. We're told in this chapter that sacrifices are only to be offered in the tabernacle, not on any other kind of altar, and that there is never to be any eating of blood or eating an animal torn by beasts. And so this points to the sanctity of life and the sanctity of blood, this idea that the life of any living being is in its blood, and therefore one should not eat or drink of its blood. Following this, in the Holiness Code, we turn to moral laws. And after an introduction, there's a long chapter on sexual morality. And this points to the sanctity of sexuality. And we are given a list of forbidden relationships, most of which are incest. Also, we have homosexual acts in there. We have bestiality and others that are all severely punished as a grave violation of the sanctity that God demands of his people. Chapter 19 has a variety of holiness precepts, including some of the famous verses that we know from Leviticus, such as Leviticus 19 verses 1 to 2. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to all the congregation of the children of Israel, and say to them, You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." The call to holiness, which is at the heart of Leviticus. Also in chapter 19, verse 18, "You shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." So the second of the great commandments that Jesus quotes is from the book of Leviticus, chapter 19. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. So these laws of sexual morality followed by holiness precepts. Then we have other statutes and judgments. And chapter 20 is all about penalties for violations of the laws, and especially the laws of sexual morality that we saw in chapter 18. We're told shockingly that the penalties for most of those sins is death. And it shows once again that sexuality is no small matter, that it very much matters to God because that's the means by which humans communicate life, that they are fruitful and multiply and pass on the divine life that God has given us. And so laws of sexual morality are essential for the sake of living a holy life. Chapters 21 and 22 are about laws of priestly holiness. So laws of purity, laws for priests and laws for the high priest, including who they can marry. And so there's a higher standard of holiness that is required of them. Then we have disqualifying physical defects, so they must be physically in good shape. And also the offerings must be without blemish. So certain things profane a priest. We have some persons who are not authorized to eat the offerings, and list of blemishes that disqualify animals from being offered, and the eligibility and age of offerings. Okay, so laws of priestly holiness. As you can see, we have our chiastic structure. We had chapters 8 to 10 were about the priesthood, and now chapters 21 to 22 are also about the priesthood. Chapter 23 is Israel's liturgical calendar. It lists all the major feasts and appointed times for Israel by which they will sanctify the whole year to the Lord. This includes the Sabbath, the one day of the week that commemorates creation and also Israel's redemption from Egyptian slavery. Then we have Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the first fruits, the Feast of Weeks or Shavuot, the Feast of Trumpets in the fall, and then the Day of Atonement, and then the Feast of Tabernacles and what is known as Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day of the Feast of Tabernacles. You can see on the screen here when these feasts occur. And so Passover and unleavened bread, first fruits and the Feast of Weeks occur in the spring. So we're talking about late March to May. And then we have a long period of the summer months when there are no feasts. And then we have the 3 fall feasts, Trumpets, Atonement, and Tabernacles, that all occur in late September, early October. This is a very interesting topic in itself because these feasts of Israel in many ways are fulfilled in the life of the church. Now, you're going to be aware of some of these, but maybe not all of them. Most Christians know that the Passover is the context for Jesus' Last Supper, that Jesus was celebrating the Passover with his disciples. And so the Passover anticipates Jesus' death, the Passover when they had to slaughter a lamb and they had to shed its blood, and the blood protected the Israelites from the angel of death, and they had to eat of the Passover lamb, and none of its bones should be broken. So all this points to Jesus' death. The Feast of Unleavened Bread points to Jesus' burial, and the Feast of the First Fruits, all of this occurred basically in the same week, points to Jesus' resurrection, Jesus who is the first fruits of his resurrection. So the first 3 feasts really point to the Paschal mystery, the Holy Week and Easter. Then we have 50 days between first fruits and the day of Pentecost. Pentecost celebrated for Israel the giving of the law of the Torah, and in the Christian dispensation we see the outpouring of the Holy Spirit and birth of the church. So all of these first 4 feasts are the spring holidays that we have seen fulfilled already in the life of Christ. But what about the last 3 feasts? How are these fulfilled? Well, the short answer is that they are not yet fulfilled. The Feast of Trumpets points to the final judgment. St. Paul in his epistles talks about the blowing of the trumpet that's going to mark the coming of the Lord. The Day of Atonement, the separation of the goats, points also to the final judgment. And so the coming of the Lord, the final judgment, and the Feast of Tabernacles points to heaven, to the moment when the believers will come into the heavenly dwelling to dwell with God forever, and they will remember their frail tabernacles in which they lived, namely our bodies here on earth, just as Israel in the Feast of Tabernacles had to remember their wanderings through the wilderness and when they dwelt in these fragile dwellings. So here we have it, these spring feasts, Passover fulfilled in the Passover of the Lord, Pentecost or Shavuot fulfilled with the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, and then trumpets, atonement, and tabernacles that will be fulfilled with the second coming of the Lord. We are wrapping things up in the Holiness Code and the book of Leviticus. Chapter 24 is about the continual offerings, including some regulations for how to make the oil of the menorah and to prepare the bread of the presence. Then we have this short narrative on a blasphemer who was put to death, and we are given the lex talionis, or the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, on how to establish justice among the congregation of Israel. The long chapter 25 is about the sabbatical year and the Jubilee year. And so after 7 years, or every 7 years, Israelites are not to sow or to reap in their fields. They are to let the land rest and be fallow for that 1 year. And after 49 years, a Jubilee year is to be declared, in which all debts will be remitted and freedom will be declared for all slaves. And so this is like a macro vision of what the Sabbath is supposed to be, this day of rest, this day of liberation, which is expanded and extended into the 7th year, the sabbatical year, and the 49th or 50th year of the Jubilee. As we come near the end of the book of Leviticus, we see that this covenant that the Lord has made with his people is sealed with blessings and curses. These are the terms of the covenant. In other words, Israel, if you follow these commandments, you're going to be blessed, you're going to be fruitful, you're going to multiply, you're going to live in prosperity, in peace, in abundance, and all shall be well with you. But if you do not, all these curses will fall upon you. You're going to be barren, you're going to be afflicted, you're going to be oppressed by enemies, and ultimately you will be sent into exile and you will die. These laws of the covenant are essential. They are truly a matter of life and death for Israel. And even if they fail, ultimately God will restore them. So at the end of this chapter, there's a promise of God's covenantal faithfulness and his future restoration, even if Israel fails to keep the covenant. We end the book of Leviticus with an epilogue on vows and tithes, and this concludes our quick survey of the book of Leviticus. Once again, it is Israel's call to holiness. What can we learn from this book? That God truly desires our holiness, and that these commandments really point to the way of living in communion with God, even if today we read them in light of the New Testament. That concludes our survey of the book of Leviticus. We will continue next time with the book of Numbers. Shalom and God bless.